Get started here. Thank you everyone for joining us today for the HMSC Research Seminar. My name is Yi-Chung Chung, and I am the Academic Program Manager at the Oregon State University's Hatfield Marine Science Center here in Newport, Oregon. I'll be your host of today's talk, and we have just a couple of logistics I want to go over with you. We'd like to have your mics and cameras and screen share off as we move forward through this event. And then at the end, we'll open it up for questions. Please ask any of your questions you might have using the chat box found at the bottom or the top of your Zoom screen at any time, and we will answer any questions at the end of this talk. We'll be recording this event and it will be posted in a few days on the HMSC website's past seminar page. And I'll put that link in the chat for folks to access. All right, so some quick announcements. Our next Hatfield Marine Science Center Science on Tap is January 19th at 6 p.m. When Sylvia Imada will talk with us about the invasive European green crab in Oregon waters. Then please join us for next week's seminar on January 20th when Alexandra McInturf at the CSOS, I don't know what the acronym sounds like, but it's the Cooperative Institute for Climate, Ocean, and Ecosystem Studies, which is a consortium with the University of Washington, Alaska, Fairbanks, and OSU. And so Alexandra is a postdoctoral fellow with the Big Fish Lab here at Oregon State University. And we'll be talking about a multi-scale approach to understanding fish responses to environmental change in the California ecosystems. All right, so again, if you need more info or the links to our upcoming events, check the homepage and scroll to the bottom for more details at hmsc.oregonstate.edu. Now I'll put that in the link as well. I'll put that link in the chat as well. So for today, let me tell you a little more about our speaker. Francisco Guerrero is a researcher and a science communicator. He's trained as an aquatic biologist with a master's in hydrosystems. Francisco came from Colombia to pursue a dual major PhD in sustainable forest management and water resources science at Oregon State University. He's been a water resources consultant for the Nature Conservancy, a water quality modeler for the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, and a science journalist for CNN and Espanol. Most recently, Francisco worked as the science communication liaison between the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis at UC Santa Barbara, and also Compass, which is a science communication nonprofit. Currently, he is a courtesy faculty member of the College of Forestry at OSU. Again, let's welcome Francisco here today to our seminar. You have our attention. Take it away.
Thank you, Yi-Chung. Thank you, everyone, for being here today, and also for the invitation to this seminar. I'm really happy to have this opportunity to share with you. I want to do a couple of things before we get started with our question of the day. The first one is I want to present my acknowledgements. Let me see if I can. That's not what we want. This go first. All the lab and all the people that are behind the data that I'm going to be showing you today. The Forest Soil Lab with Dr. Guerrero at the College of Forestry at Oregon State University. A big portion of the project for what I'm going to be sharing or showing data today was funded by the United States EPA, and my PhD was funded by the government of Colombia. So these institutions and many other people are behind this, what we're going to be looking at today. The other thing I want to add, as Yi-Chung said, I'm from Colombia, so that means that I am native Spanish speaker, so I have an accent. So if for some reason there is something that you can understand or follow, or maybe I got excited and started to speak too fast, just let me know, and please, if you want to unmute yourself or please feel free to let me know, and then we can share the information. So the question that I decided to reflect about when I was putting together this talk was this one: like, should we bury our forests in the bottom of the ocean to fight climate change? And I'm not gonna wait until the end of the talk to tell you the answer. My answer is yes, we should do that. The question though is like how to do it in the most sustainable way. And the reason I'm thinking about which ways may work or may not is kind of connected to something that also I got to think more about more recently after I left grad school, which is retirement. And please forgive me for this metaphor if it doesn't work for you, but also I've been kind of hanging out with a book club with the average age is 60 plus. So there's a lot of conversations about this. But the reason I'm bringing this here is because when we think about the potential solutions that we have for climate change, that reminds me a little bit of the problem that we have when we're planning to retire. So you start planning ahead, and then at the beginning of the process, you are more risk tolerant. You can invest in stocks and in some funding in some areas that can be more volatile. And a lot of the solutions that we are exploring based on technologies for climate change and pretty recent, and they also come with a lot of consideration about the uncertainties that they can bring. As we get closer to the deadline, we start investing in more stable, solid, reliable portfolios. And in our case, those are our naturals that have been working for millennia, for millions of years to sustain the planet in the way that it was. So many of us sometimes feel conflicted about how we should manage our forests. Is it more technology heavy, or is it more towards the conservation side of things? And I'm still exploring the answer to that question. And I've been thinking a lot about the systems that I studied during my PhD, which are the old growth forests in the Pacific Northwest. And I'm kind of leaning towards like we should keep them where they are. And I'm going to give you the reasons why and along this talk. Before, let me preface with this idea of like studying forests and rivers and climate change. They are all connected. And the recognition of this link between forests and rivers and the global climate is quite recent. Actually, it was started in 2007. That paper of Plumbing the Global Carbon Cycle was a synthesis paper, actually, that was produced at the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis. And it was the first time when the researchers were calling our attention to realize that all the carbon that was reaching the ocean was coming from inland, but all the carbon that was reaching the ocean from the land was not necessarily the same amount that entered from the beginning. That along the way, a lot of carbon was being redistributed, was being sent back to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide, or was being stored in the sediments. So when they were doing or making the calculations to balance how much do we get in the ocean, or how much do we need on land to get this amount in the ocean, they realized like they needed to account for more and more. And that balance keeps changing. So at the beginning of the story in 2017, it was thought that, well, we get 0.9 pyrograms or megatons of carbon, which is a lot, in the ocean. So that's basically what the land is exporting. But when they started to analyze all the processes that take place in the river, they realized that, okay, actually, if we take into account the amount of carbon dioxide that rivers emit to the atmosphere and the carbon that gets trapped in the sand, it actually needs more. Those numbers keep being revised. Every year or every 5 years, there's a new balance that is presented, and the numbers are just growing. The amount of carbon that we need from land to reach the ocean in the amount that we normally see is growing and growing because of the recognition of multiple processes that take place across these ecosystems. So this is kind of like a quick review of how this works. So when we think about the carbon cycle, you have to think in terms of like two different time scales. This is time scale that happens at the scale of millions of years. That's what we call the geological carbon cycle, and is the one that is related to the fossil fuels or to the oil, gas, and all the products that we use now in our economy. So for that carbon to cycle through that process, as I say, it takes millions of years, but that's the kind of carbon that we are putting into the atmosphere when we burn fossil fuels. It's like taking your savings for retirement and spending them, right now. It's like you are not, that investment is, you're going to need it in the future and it's just being wasted right now. So the other part of the cycle is one that takes place in years, at the scale of years and centuries and even millennia, and it involves forests, soils, and rivers. And it's the one here in yellow. And that's the one, that part of the cycle is the one we're banking on or trying to revert all the carbon dioxide that we've been, basically carbon dioxide that we've been emitting to the atmosphere through the burning of fossil fuels. But to understand how that process works is quite complicated, actually. I started studying what happened to the leaves that fall into the streams during the fall, and the interactions that take place in rivers are just amazing. It's not only water and the plant material that just fell in there. It's all the sediments and how they mix together and how they actually interact, not only chemically, but also physically, as I'm going to tell you along this presentation. So understanding that, how can we manage our forests and rivers and ecosystems in a way that we preserve the way that this carbon cycle occurs at the scale of years is really important, but depends on how much we know about how the carbon moves from the forest to the bottom of the ocean to get finally buried there. So that means that we need to study these terrestrial aquatic carbon fluxes, which include the movement of plant and soil erosion, because there's a lot of carbon also trapped in the soil. And finally, when all that is transported to the river, it reaches deposition environments like lakes and oceans. And in those deposition environments, depending on the physical conditions, if it's a really energetic ocean, sometimes a lot of these particles get dispersed. But if it's a calm setting, like in a lake, it can be just deposited in the bottom of these lakes and stored there for millennia. So part of the reason that all these processes become so important for us here in the Pacific Northwest is because these locations or our coastal ecosystems are now recognized as centers of organic carbon burial and oxidation at that land-ocean interface. We have to deal with that, with those two big ecosystems and how they talk to each other. And this map that these authors presented in their article show us where are those centers for burial and carbon deposition and also oxidation, which means stuff going back to the atmosphere. And you can see here, obviously, the Oregon coast is one of those places. So I got really lucky to be here and to get the opportunity to study carbon cycling in these ecosystems because they are strategic. But what makes them so important is that we have mountains. We have the Oregon Coast Range, and it's being shown over and over again that the small mountainous rivers are disproportionately large exporters of biospheric organic carbon. What I mean by biospheric is like the carbon that is being just taken out by the plants and is living in the litter on the superficial soils. When you are on a high slope, gravity and water are just going to move a lot of that material into the river channels, but also disturbances are going to, add trees and branches and a lot of these materials. So that's a result of living in this environment, mountainous environment that produce this large amount of carbon into the rivers. But, we have to deal with another option, another competitor for the amount of carbon that we have in our forests, and it's timber harvesting. And this is kind of like the look of our landscapes, this patchy distribution of portions of forest and other portions of harvested forest. And we've been wondering for a while, and not only us, but as a community, what are the effects of this timber harvesting on the forest carbon cycle? Does it affect? Does it produce more sediment or not? What's happening there? And it's a tricky question as well. And it depends, or it requires our study at different time scales. We need to study what happens with a storm, because those events are really are moving a lot of material, and a lot of the hydrodynamics and the physical processes that take place into the river affect the amount of carbon that gets away. But also we need to look into the long-term records. We need to look at what happened after 5 years after cutting the forest, what happens 20 years after, what happens 30 years after, what happens and how that does compare to the historical disturbance regime. And then you need to look into time scales of centuries or millennia. And we had the opportunity to do all that when we were working on this research. And I want to share with you some of that. We studied different settings. One of them is the A.J. Andrews. So we studied the particulate organic carbon exports from a watershed that was preserved, an old growth forest, and you can see how the channel looked like. We're here, and logged watershed or clear-cut watershed, and which is the channel that you see on this side. Now, I have to say, the reason the channel looks like that is because after the logging, they also got a debris flow that scored the channel to the bedrock. So that was kind of like a confluence of humans and natural disturbances. So I'm going to share a little bit with you about that. And let me see. Okay. I think I need to go back. So I'm going to pause here because I want to use an interactive app that at the end, if you're interested in looking into this interactive poster about this part of the research, I'm going to share the link. For right now, I'm just going to use it in presentation mode. So I'm going to stop sharing this screen for right now, and I'm going to share that application. So let me check. Are you looking at is the Zoom application, or are you looking at a slide on my Internet Explorer?
Looks like but important questions remain unanswered.
Okay, that's great. That's what we want to look at. Perfect. Thank you. So this is that study that I was mentioning at the A.J. Andrews. Over 30 years, in 1975, this pair watershed experiment took place in these watersheds. And what they did was to remove basically everything that they have, not only on the land, but also along the channel. And what they wanted to know was what could be the effects of this logging on sediment export. But we also realized that if you had a collection of these samples and they were preserved by the archive on the A.J. Andrews, we could actually ask questions about how much carbon was leaving these watersheds in the two different conditions. And because the sediments that the clear cut happened in 1975, they had a long-term record of those sediments, and we could analyze them. And then But on top of what I said, and I already mentioned it, while they were doing the logging experiment a few years later in 1986, there was a debris flow that scored the channel to the bedrock and also changed the dynamics of the particles. So we were dealing not only with the logging treatment, but the influence of this disturbance that took place in that location. And one of the things I started to think about is like, who are these particles that travel? What is this carbon? Because we like to think, or we used to think about this carbon in terms of like just a component of the sediments. But what is happening really is that you have a bunch of particles that are coming from different locations. You have surface soils, you have the leader, you have multiple subpopulations of particles, you heterogeneity or diversity, if you want, of particles. And that is really difficult to incorporate in the statistical models that we normally use to model these results. But we actually were able, and I'm not going into all the details, but we use a novel model that is called beta regression, because that model actually is a typical regression model, but it allows you to handle multiple populations at the same time with the same regression line. So you can ask questions about, okay, what happened with the leader? What happened with the soils? Using all the same variables at the same time. And what we found in that study is that what you're looking here at is like, these are density plots. These are the distribution of the populations of the particles. In purple, you're seeing the amount of carbon that is in these particles in the old growth watershed that was used as a control. And in orange, you're seeing the distribution of the carbon content in the particles that were draining or leaving the logged watershed. So either overall or through the different seasons, except with the in the case of the winter, there's more carbon in the particles that were leaving the old growth forest in their sediments. So what's that? That's what the model helped us a lot, because we could identify different subpopulations of these particles. And what we found basically relates to the colors that you're seeing here. This is the export of organic carbon from these watersheds along the water day through all these 30 years of data that we put together. And what you can tell here, the colors is like the brown colors are soil material, and the greener are kind of like more plant-like materials. So on the top of this, you have the old growth watershed, and clearly you can see that the composition in terms of like the subpopulations of particles that are traveling there is larger compared to what is being exported from the watershed that was logged, which is mostly soil. So the thing with these watersheds is that for a long time, they operate like storage compartments in the landscape. So they are getting all this carbon there. And then when disturbance happens, like the floods in 1996, they release a lot of this carbon. So to have stuff stored in there, you need to have a populations of trees, the big trees, in part to contribute to a lot of this material. So what in fact happening when we retire these trees is that it could occur, and the probability of occurrence of these debris flows and other kind of like disturbances that impact the soil is higher. So you end up exporting more of the soil that was storing carbon already. When you protect the old growth forest, for instance, what you have is thicker forest floors or thicker organic material along the forest, over the soil on top of the soil, sorry. And then that's what gets exported, and is easier to replenish that material after the disturbance passes compared to a watershed that is not. So this one is an entire poster that I used to present at as the Oslo conference. And if you want to take a look at it later, I can share the link on the chat. But for right now, we're going to come back to the presentation. So I'm going to start sharing this one. So I just saw one of the questions in the chat, and my point about why is that we need this forest to move the carbon from the land to the ocean is because they do it burning only biospheric carbon. As they transport all this carbon and put it into the ocean, there is carbon that is released to the atmosphere again, but that was carbon that was recently fixed. If we were to do this with trucks, we would need to use oil again. And actually, that was studied at Oregon State. I think her name is Tara Hodeberg in 2012, and she studied the entire life cycle of the process of like removing the trees, putting them into kind of like sustainable uses, and using biofuel for to load the trucks. And still, the emissions were larger than what we would expect and what we needed to be carbon neutral. So nature has figured out this. I mean, I'm not against the technologies, but what I'm talking about here is like it's a really delicate balance. And all growth forests have been doing this for millennia, and that at that scale is that they have been contributing to hold the climate in the way that it is been so far. So the things that we need to do to understand all these processes requires you to go into the world of these particles. And most of the time, the kind of particles that you're going to find in the river cover a wide range of things. You can find stuff that we call dissolved organic matter that is over here, really tiny things. And you can have wood debris. So you can have a wide range of stuff floating and moving close to the bottom of the river. The problem that we have had so far is that we break disciplines by the type of particles that we study. So we haven't been able to put everything together to realize or to measure more accurately how much carbon is moving through this system. So I use I use a lot of chemistry to understand what's happening there and if I can get clues or insights on the movement of these particles. And this one, for instance, is like trying to identify the sources that are providing carbon to the river. A lot of the time, we think that the river looks like the mixing scenario, like the boring mojito. You know, like it's just the mint leaf and the lemon there, but it's no really mix. It's just there. You can see the components there. But when things go into the river, what happens is a lot of muddling, which is the good mojito. You know, it's like the one that tastes good. I mean, maybe it's my bias, but that's the physical processes that take place. But we treat the rivers and that our understanding about how carbon moves through them using the mixing scenario, which again, it provides it gives us a lot of questions that are not still answered. The problem with modeling, I mean, it's so cool to drink a mojito like that, but it means that when you are going to study the carbon, looking at the mud or the sediments, this is how it looks like. So again, there are a lot of things that you can't see with a naked eye. So you have to rely on chemistry and other elements to understand what's happening there. So that's what I do. So I analyze or I study the mud at 3 different levels. I study the diversity of the particle sizes, and I'm gonna talk more into that. I also study the basic chemistry. So how much carbon do these particles carry? How much nitrogen or other elemental components? And I also use what I call advanced chemistry, which is stable isotope ratios and other chemical characteristics that can help us understand where this carbon is coming from and where it's been before it gets to the bottom of the lake. On top of all that complexity of chemistry, as I mentioned before, we also have a lot of a really energetic, highly active disturbance regime in the Pacific Northwest. We have landslides, we have earthquakes, we have fires, and we have floods. And more recently, we added to that mixture timber harvesting. All these things together produce signals that travel down the river and get to these depositional environments to finally reflect what's happening. But I'm not using the word signal like casually here. I'm using it because there is a dampening of that signal. So things that take a look uphill or upstream might represent a really tiny change in the bottom of the ocean, in the bottom of a lake. So when we see smaller changes down there, it's because probably bigger changes are happening or were amplified upstream. And that connection is really difficult to understand because of all the elements that we need to take into account. So I'm going to quickly go through this, one of the other studies that we did was along the Alsea River after the Great Coastal Gale in 2007. And what we did here was a collection of samples along the Alsea River from the headwaters to the estuary. So that's what you're seeing from, well, I guess it's right to left in my screen, close to the ocean. So we wanted to see how the particles that were traveling with the river were deposited along, and what were their chemical characteristics along that river channel. And I'm not gonna go into the chemical details for this one, but what I want to tell you about what we found there is that the Alsea rivers and many of these rivers in the Oregon Coast Range have a bedrock channel. It's kind of like cement down there, but obviously natural cement in the sense of like, this is just a rock, sedimentary rocks that have been there since these mountains emerged. And these rocks are really particular. And these rivers as well, they fragment really easily. In 15 minutes, if you throw a rock into the Alsea River and let it go downstream, that rock disappears in 15 minutes. It's just gone into fine particles and sediments. So imagine what could happen to a trunk or a leaf that goes into that river. It's basically pulverized. So a lot of changes are happening there because of that. Same happens along the Umpqua River. And there's a really cool study about that by O'Connor. If you have questions about that or you're interested in about what happens with the sediments and how they move through our channels, Oregon Coast Range, I can share a link to that study. The point with that is like, we have these big masses of chunks of wood and material that is coming from the headwaters when disturbances happen. And then they go into this reef and they get like, just go through all this modeling and fragmentation to become tiny particles. And these particles are going to be more susceptible to transport effects, like what is going to go floating, what is going to go close to the bottom of the river. And that creates a signal that is quite complex. But we found a way to try to understand the signals in a better way when we started to look at a longer time scale. So this is the last study I want to mention. It's the Loon Lake watershed study. It's in the Umpqua River Basin. And what we got there was a sediment core about 7 meters long that was encompassing 1,500 years of natural history in that watershed. And so we decided to analyze all these physical and chemical characteristics of the particles that were stored in that lake and see what could they tell us about the story of this watershed. And so this is how the lake, the core looked like, and this is all the the machinery that we had to bring to that lake. This is end of the summer in 2013, and on the left over here is how the core looked like, in real life. Like you see all these layers over here. Each one of them correspond to an event of deposition, normally an annual event. So by counting these layers, you can actually have a time series of events being happening along the lake. So that's what we call varved sediments, because you can see the passage of time through them. Okay, I'm seeing more questions, but I'll come back to that at the end. So, so here's the thing. I start to think about this bottom of the lake as a hard drive, because it's an archive. You have files, there. I thought that each layer could be like a file, a computer file. And because of that, I started to think about, okay, well, if it was a computer file, I know that computers store information by using different combinations of zeros and ones. What are the zeros and ones of these sedimentary files in the bottom of the lake? And then I thought, okay, the grain sizes. So in the same way that the computer used just zeros and ones to store information, the bottom of a lake use different combinations of particle sizes. That was my hypothesis. They should be reflected, or the changes that we're expecting to see there, they should be reflected in the composition, in the texture of those layers. But as you saw, they're really thin, they're really tiny, and you couldn't see all those changes just with your naked eye. So I needed to figure out, how can I measure those? How can I measure that heterogeneity? And that's what the mathematics of computer language came to help me, actually. And that metaphor actually ended up working for me, because in 1948, the idea of like how to measure the amount of information that is contained in any kind of code, whether it is grains or whether it is zeros and ones, came out with what is known as information theory. And that mathematical framework proved to be really useful for me to understand the history of Loon Lake. So basically what I'm telling you is, like, on the left, you have the images that we can obtain from sediment cores. You can use different categorizations like clay, silt, and sand to identify kind of like which trends are happening there. You can take photographs, you can take CT scans of the core and try to do a lot of analysis. A lot of this is kind of like a mixture of quantitative and qualitative methods, and a lot of it looks like an art, actually. But I wanted to be able to do a little bit more with direct measurements. And so what happens here is that when you're studying a sediment core, you take those slices, you try to go for one of the layers if you can, but sometimes they are so thin that you can't separate a single one, so you have to go with a little chunk. You take that sample, and then you count the different kind of particles that are there. You know, let's say in this case that we have the blues, the black, and the other colors, so you start just counting particles. Obviously, we're not talking about counting this manually. We do this with laser granulometry. So you put this in a laser machine, and the machine tells you like what particles and their sizes are there. So it comes with something that people normally assimilate to a distribution and try to use like metrics like median and variance and skewness and things like that. But this is just basically a collection of different kind of a species, you know. Each particle might have their own history and reasons why they got there. So more than just a single distribution of a single population, as I was saying before, this could be the superposition of multiple population particles. And so how can we break that down and get the information on the stories that these particles might be telling us? So this is what happens with the result of that laser granulometry. You get that slice, and then you get a really high detailed profile of the different particle sizes that are there. And you can classify them by the amount of particles that are in that sample. So that's what you call, because you're doing this in a vial, you measure the volume, how much of the volume is occupied by different kind of particles. Then the particles that have high volume, they come at higher values, and the particles that have lower values, and it's kind of like what I'm representing here with red, and the particles that come at lower volumes, they come at the black or white colors. So each slice, if we were to look at it from the top, I think, I hope you can see there's a little eye over here. So if you were to look at that from the top, it would look like this. As a slice of the core once we have measured the particle size inside of that layer. And now think, this is a collection of 700 layers, because we went for 1 centimeter resolution along that 7 meter long core. So we have a lot of these ones. So, sorry, this is kind of like a duplicate here. So what is going to happen is that each layer is going to have their own kind of like visualization. And if you put these together, you have like a representation, a different representation or a map of this sediment core that can be quantified and dealt with math more easily. So that's what I did for this part of the research. And since this is a sediment core, this is from the bottom of a lake. Each deposit that is going to the bottom is older, and the top layers are the newer deposits. So the axis of time is actually going in the vertical. So I don't want to give you a headache, but I'm going to flip this core so we can start thinking more in the sequence of time. So old things are going to be to the left and new things are going to be to the right. So this is the first 200 centimeters of that sediment core. So here this was to 2013, and somewhere here along this place is 1945, and all these other ones extend back to 500. I mean, the year 500, so 1500 years back into the past. So using a math of information theory, and this is the entire core, I started analyzing these particle sizes, but I also wanted to see if these particle changes that I was observing here were corresponding to events that were already identified by other techniques and by multiple lines of evidence. And it turns out that along that sediment core, we identified layers that corresponded to multiple earthquakes that took place, including the earthquake around 1700, which is over here. What is interesting is that the signal is not really strong for that one. And I'll mention something about why could that be the case, but others are clearly represented in the record. Again, here's when we have the time when timber harvesting started in these watersheds. This is 1945. So you can start seeing a few differences in the texture in this sediment that was stored in the lake before, which is basically the historical, disturbance regime, and when we came to use the forest there. So again, I could extract a signal. This thing that you're seeing over here, this black line, is a diversity of all the particles that were there. So I started thinking like each particle was an species living in the bottom. So I could measure a diversity index, which is basically information theory or computer math. And I started noticing that actually there were oscillations in that entropy, in that diversity, that were corresponding to the events that we were observing throughout the core, as we also saw here. But now I was measuring this in a way that was more tractable for me. Measure other things. We measure the amount of carbon that is in that core. We measure the nitrogen to carbon ratio, which tells you when stuff is coming more for plants and soils, and other things like stable isotopes. With more time, I will go into more detail, but I want to highlight this one over here. This is a forest fire that happened really close to the lake, and you can see how much carbon brought into the system. And because it's over here low in the CNC ratio, that means that it was a lot of plant material that was just buried there in that system. Something similar happened over here, but with less amount of carbon in the particles. What we found in this portion over here was a chunk of a tree just there. So it wasn't just carbon broken into little tiny particles, it was just a chunk. And that we didn't measure the amount of carbon in that one because we were interested in the sediments, but that explains why you don't see a big jump here in carbon, because it wasn't available in the way of those tiny particles. So understanding the diversity of those particles also helped me to identify how much carbon was coming from the rivers and how much carbon was arriving to the bottom of the lake from other sources of different other type of mechanisms. So when I talk about the diversity of these particles, I got to separate them into colloidal aggregates, clay, fine sands, medium sands, and coarse sands. Now, this is not the classification that we normally go with the textbook. This is a classification or the thresholds or the groupings were informed by that information metric that I was using to classify the sediments. So we could clearly separate and compare with the samples from other rivers, and all the particles on this site were coming to the lake. Basically, it's fluvial material, but we had a lot of material getting there that wasn't necessarily related to the input of the river or had less influence from fluvial processes. So that got us to question or to ask ourselves, like, what was happening in terms of climate, and how could we explain all these changes in the variability and the diversity of the particles? By the time that I was putting this data together, there were a few studies already showing kind of like the history way back, to the record, because again, we were dealing with a record of 1,500 years, and the processes that could be affecting all the sediments reaching the bottom of this lake. Could you imagine all the things that could happen in 1,500 years? So this over here is a precipitation proxy that tells you or tells a story about the times when we had cold and wet weather, or hot and dry. And this over here is what is called the medieval climatic anomaly. And this over here was the Little Ice Age. During this medieval climatic anomaly, it was really dry and hot, but the winters could be wet. And during the Little Ice Age, it was really cold, and the winters also could be dry. So it is really interesting the way that the things that interact to define these climatic characteristics that has affected our landscape are so interesting. This is a result of the ENSO variability when the ocean basically talks with the land about the climate. That conversation is really interesting. This was a sediment record that was studied by Colombaroli around that time, showing the increased amount of sedimentation that was generated after 1945 in this ecosystem. So I wanted to compare my records to what they had. And the first thing that I noticed is that Colombaroli used a proxy for sedimentation that was based on a category of size, which was silt. He arbitrarily chose which particle size I'm going to use to tell the story. When you do that, the story can get a little bit distorted. And I proved that that was the case in the case of my sediments, because I also started to okay, I'm going to select arbitrarily a particle size and see what kind of signal I can recover. You recovered probably huge aspects or important aspects of the signal there, but you get a lot of noise because you are not necessarily identifying which are the particles that should be telling you the story about the lake. When you actually let the sediment core to tell you which particles you should use, the signal comes really, really clean. And when you do that, and when you put together that during all this time, we have a really active disturbance regime with like earthquakes and fires, basically we are forced to think that this part here, all this sedimentation that been happening in the last few years is part of the impacts of forestry practices that we were implementing in the first part of the 20th century, but still have legacies when extreme events hit our forests. And what this means is that when these floodings or these extreme events hit the forests that have been managed, they end up exporting more soil and less carbon to the bottom of these lakes. So they stop functioning the way that they used to be in terms of like protecting or managing the carbon cycle that takes place in these strategic ecosystems in the Pacific Northwest. So to the question of like, should we let the forest bury their own carbon? Yes, I say yes, because they've been doing it pretty efficiently. When we intervene in a lot of them without the knowledge that we should have about these ecosystems, we might create some additional issues here. So what ended up happening, what we saw through all these processes, is that the forestry signal was really loud in the sediment core. You could see it even from the pictures at the beginning on the structure of the layers, and we could measure it directly with when we started considering that different particles are traveling along these sediments. Shaking forestry, because I mean, when we look back at that slide, we're comparing all the events that took place since 1945 to things that were probably related to earthquakes. So is it possible that forestry could produce impacts on the landscape that are, comparable to forestry? I don't know, but what we know is that the post-World War II timber harvesting in the Oregon Coast Range resulted in higher sedimentation rates than those produced by natural disturbances, including earthquakes. But story doesn't end there. And this is something that I'm working on right now, because recently in the middle of the pandemic, but we probably missed a lot of stuff during the pandemic. In 2020 September, this paper came out. Rainfall triggers more deep-seated landslides and Cascadia earthquakes in the Oregon Coast Range. So what they're saying basically that we should be more afraid of extreme rainfall events than actually earthquakes in terms of producing landslides, which seems a little bit counterintuitive. The caveat with this study, I have to say, is that when they used precipitation, they didn't use a historical record covering the millennia that they were analyzing to understand the landslides. They used only the average precipitation of the last 30 years for each one of the locations. So they had better spatial resolution, but no the temporal resolution. Since we do have the precipitation records for the last 1500 years, and we have these events that took place in our lake, now I want to know if this is really happening. It was rain, or was it the earthquake, which was triggering all the sediments that you saw being deposited at the bottom of the lake? So again, should we bury our forests in the bottom of the ocean? Yes. We should let the portion of the old growth forest that we still have to do that part of the job. Which options for management are out there for us to manage this in the future and to prevent more damaging impacts on our ecosystems? It's an ongoing task, and it requires a lot of conversations between us, scientists, and policymakers, and also the public understanding, like how important are these remaining forests that we have as safeguards of the climate that is still there for us. So with that, if there are any questions, I want to thank you again for joining this seminar. We went through a lot of information. This probably was a kind of like a fire hose of information, but if there's any question, curiosity, just let me know. And I'm going to share that link I mentioned to the story of the Andrews on the chat. So if you want to visit that, you're welcome to do.
Okay, thank you. Wow, I look forward to reading that paper once it's published. Questions from the audience. You can unmute and you can turn your video on if you prefer, or you can type your question in the chat. And there's already a question on there.
Oh yeah, let me see.
From Fran, rivers are down to bedrock because a lot of large wood was removed from them, and the rivers down cut and get removed from their floodplain, which would hold sediments. Is this pertinent to your studies?
Well, yes, I'm pretty sure that there are many of these rivers that look that way, but there are others that, like the Alsea River, that could have more wood. But when you look kind of like at the template in the summer and kind of like what is in the bottom of the river, it doesn't have a lot of like how to retain it. And that study that I mentioned by O'Connor, what he shows there is like it's because of this fragmentation of the rocks from what is called the Taí Formation. Those sedimentary rocks, they break really fast. So these rivers don't have a lot of like rocks or things that can serve like a like a retention devices. So they are basically these bare channels. But definitely is a problem. The amount of wood that is being reduced from our river channels is significant. And there's also a recent study by Ellen Wall that she's an amazing geomorphologist, where she did a first estimate about the amount of wood that was delivered from land to the ocean, and clearly she's pointing out that it's been a dramatic reduction compared to historical ranges. So it depends on different watersheds, but you could have a bedrock river because of just the geology of the terrain allowing it to be like that.
I have a question.
Yes, please go ahead, Ronan.
Yeah, okay. So I mean, a lot of it is over my head, but I'm looking at your research going 1,500 years ago, and I'm thinking also of not just the 1948 or whenever it was that, but I'm also looking at what happened before settling the settlement of the country here, and the changes that that brought about even before deforestation, meaning like like channeling all the watershed into single rivers versus all those, I mean, and I'm talking about the landscape before the decimation of the beavers, and before all the farming practices, of trying to control the landscape that way. And I wonder if there's anything that relates to your research that takes that into consideration.
Yeah, that's a great question. And yes, I was curious about that too, because the person I work with that took the sediment core, she did an amazing compilation of the history. And Loon Lake actually was used to kind of like move wood down the river. But we were surprised that not a lot of that was kind of like reflected directly into the chemical characteristics of the sediment core. But there's still a lot of chemical analysis that we're running to see that if those other historical activities, could have affected the record. The other part also that we know introduced a lot of changes is changes in the valley, and the valley was affected, because this was a dam, a natural dam that was created by the landslide and stopped the river from flowing. And so the valley up there was being cleared also. And valleys for these rivers are important locations for storage of organic matter and materials that eventually get to the lake. And that's another part of the question that we need to look into. Recently, what we know is like you will be surprised by the amount of carbon that is buried in those valleys, because working as a natural dam, what you get at the center of the lake is just, again, a reflection of what we moved. But when you have the opportunity to dig into the valley areas, you find like real chunks of wood. And again, there's a paper, I think Gordon Grant wrote that one recently with Roy Haggerty, where they show pictures of this was an artificial dam that was emptied, and you can see just layers and layers in the valley of wood stored there. So definitely, what happens in those locations have impacts on the amount of carbon that you can find in these ecosystems.
Thank you.
There's a question on the chat from Kelly. There's a proposed widening of river buffer zones is being considered in Oregon. Are buffers enough, or is entire watershed preservation required to be meaningful to geocarbon cycle?
That's a great question. And I also been thinking about that, because, what happens with the buffers are needed. Buffers are needed, and nature creates them. Like the riparian forest, it's something that is there in the rivers because what kind of trees you find there? Like in our streams, we find like red alder. And why red alder? Because it's a tree that it gets down with a flood and then comes back. So nature created that. And what happened with those things is like those buffers naturally also retain a lot of the sediments that come from the hill slopes, and they get like accumulate there. And so they play a natural important function, and that's why they are so important. The problem with the ones that we manage, and that's where this research was looking into by the PI, was like, are our management actions enough when extreme events hit us? because we design these management actions for kind of like the average conditions. But when you have a flood like the one in 1996, there is no riparian buffer, there is no, everything gets moving. And particularly if you have had areas in the landscape that are already being, you know, like clear. So that's where the concern is, because under average condition and in the results of the paper, you can see there was an improvement after the OFPA in 1972. But when the extreme events hit, it was just like, no, it's like they lose the strength. And unfortunately, that's what we're looking at into the future, right? Like more extreme weather events, like rain and rain on the snow. And if this results from the paper that I showed towards the end, that a lot of these landslides triggered mostly by rainfall than even earthquakes, well, we're going to be looking at a very dynamic landscape, and a lot of our practices are going to be challenged in that sense.
Wow. Again, I'm looking forward to reading this paper. Any other questions? Oh, yes, Michael.
Hi, really, thank you. That was a really expanding exercise for me to listen to. Thank you very much. I guess I wanted to just share that I've lived next to a little creek in Oregon now for 20 years. And so living right there, you know, watch things and notice things. And I've been astounded at some of the recent events in terms of, you're talking about extreme events, and what we've had more recently is warming. And I wonder if you have any comment about what your methods may be able to observe. Like you obviously had a big signal of the human, we logged the system and you could see all those signature changes. What is your feeling about how you may be able to detect some of these really extreme warming events? I mean, it's amazing. I've never seen alders and Doug fir browning in the way that they did this last summer. And I think that they would have a really extreme carbon. I mean, I've cleaned my gutters every year, and the amount of cleaning this year because of that warming was amazing. Any thoughts on that?
Okay, I want to understand the question, because so are you talking about the browning in the vegetation?
Yeah. So I mean, the Doug fir is an evergreen. It's always green, but this year they've almost looked like it is, whatever you give trees that let their leaves fall. That's what they've been doing.
Oh yeah. Okay. Well, what I can tell based on all the stuff that they've studied in the AJ Andrews is that these trees are tightly connected to the water cycle. So, and they have the root systems, and because of that, they can collect and they extract water from places where you couldn't even imagine. Like when the water goes into the soil, it goes into the tiniest pores of the soil, and these trees are able to go there and just get that water during the summer. So something has to be happening so that these trees cannot do it and start like that could happen to them. I actually saw one of the trees here in the backyard doing that, and I had the same question actually, like, but aren't they supposed to be evergreen? I mean, they lose leader, they lose material, but you don't see them going that way regularly. So the problem again is like our systems are so beautiful, but are really complex, and it takes a lot of efforts to understand the relationship between trees and water. But again, considering how remarkable they are in the use of water, particularly the big trees, it probably is a sign of something that we need to look into. Yeah.
Thank you.
We have one more question online from Greg Kritzkowski. How representative is the core collected and analyzed from Loon Lake of other watersheds in Oregon and those that go more directly into the ocean? At least in recent times, there seems to be a considerable difference in things like rainfall in northern versus southern Oregon that might affect the sedimentation.
Yeah, that's a really, really great question. And you know, the problem with sediment cores is that you cannot take a lot because it's a lot of work and it's super expensive. And that happens with natural records, you know, like ice cores, and even like retrieving something that is in really good shape and intact is really difficult. Actually, that sediment core that we took from Loon Lake, we tried like several times, and one time we just got down to 6 meters of the sediment, and we didn't know. Well, I think we were hitting rock bottom or something like that. Next time we passed the 6 meters, so we were really happy, and that's when we got that chunk of wood into the sediment core. So it's really difficult to extract them. So the way that you can try to validate is to compare with multiple records. So you can use dendrochronology from multiple lakes. You can use past reconstruction, plus climatic reconstruction at a regional scale, so to kind of see if the trends that you're observing go with this. And that's what I actually been doing. I didn't show a lot of that because I just got my hands recently on more recent data. But the record for the 1500-year precipitation that was put together by Steinman in 2012 is being validated by more and more records. I think in 2019 they published a study with 10 records from different lakes, different climatic conditions, showing consistency in and with the patterns that we observe, like the differences that we have in the northern part of the Pacific Northwest compared to the southern part, like in California. So, and that's what we actually try to do. So that's also what I put the Colombaroli record there, because you really need to rely on different sources of evidence. But as they converge, which is pretty interesting coming from different places and considering the time scales, that gives you a little bit more of certainty. But if we, if we could take more cores, I mean, that would be the ideal case. But yes, that's the limitation sometimes.
Okay, well, that Ronan, did you have a follow-up question? And then we should probably.
Okay. So I'm curious, looking at the carbon banks that we're trying to create or to hold on to, and what is the argument? Is there an argument between the old growth versus growing new trees? It's like the forestry is like, it's like, oh yeah, we're cutting the old guys and we're putting new guys and we're getting a lot of carbon into those guys. And then we make things out of it. So we're burying carbon into the industry. So versus, the old growth, oh, they're just standing there. They're not doing that much, so.
Yeah, and yes, that's still going. As I was preparing for this presentation, I came across different papers. There is this term now that is called pro-forestation instead of afforestation or reforestation, which is more like less maintain in place what we have that is working. And it's a really interesting conversation that is happening there. But I want to go back to the basics principles of biology, and I think there's a confusion when we call trees old. Trees don't die. Trees don't get old. They don't have in their DNA, like us, like instructions for their cells to just like stop working and decay. Trees are not organized that way. They are a different kind of organism that are really different from the they're plants, just for starters, but they don't die. They are just killed. Otherwise, a tree would, there are trees that have been out there for millennia. I think there's a formation of aspen trees in Utah that has been there for 80,000 years. So trees don't get old. And then because they always are producing new material, each new branch is new stuff, it's young. the difference is like what you're retiring when you kill a big tree, and that's what I call them, big trees instead of the old ones. When you retire a big tree, is a network of information that goes away. Is all the history that disappears with that tree, all the connections to the soil, the connections to the other plants, is like the internet of the forest just being taken down. So that's what we're doing with the big trees, and but they are still producing carbon, and it's being shown that the carbon that they accumulate and they store by just being there is huge compared to what we can do through management. And there's something else in that conversation about younger trees versus old trees. It appears that one of the things that limit trees is certain height. So, and that's when they kind of like could be more prone to die because of disturbances. Like, you know, if you're tall and young, maybe a storm or a fire gets you quicker than an old tree. Is an achievement, basically. A big tree is an achievement of the forest. It's like something that, you know, it's been there and survived all the things that have happened. And what I'm saying there is like, what these studies show is that these younger trees that they plant to grow faster, they die faster. So that there's a lot of stuff going on there. So that conversation is happening still, and there's a lot of materials. Again, if I just share my email on the chat, feel free to contact me, and I can you know, share what I found in that direction.
Thank you so much.
All right, thank you. Thank you for sharing your perspective. This has really been an amazing talk. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Thank you again, our speaker, for your great presentation. And we look forward to you guys next week. So thank you.
Thank you very much.